Everybody. Thank you for joining. This is very exciting because this is the first of what we hope will be many sessions on the menopause, which, as we know, is a huge kind of undiscovered topic, sauna and menopause. And I will introduce our panel. So we have Dr. Freya Bain, lecturer in psychophysiology at London South Bank University. And we have Dr. Gillian Stokes, Associate Professor of Inclusive Social Research at University College London and the co-founder of Sauna Mamas, a sauna opening in East London very soon. We have Kate Rawson, who is responsible for pulling all of this together and has done tons of work, well done Kate, in getting this to happen. And she is the owner of Saunapause, a mobile sauna in Derbyshire, and has a particular focus on women in menopause as an area. And we have Dr. Imogen Murray, a specialist doctor in sexual health for the NHS in Scotland. And we also have Lisa Zadell, a research scientist from London South Bank University, but she's going to be joining us shortly. But I think we will just start with a very quick intro. Maybe this is preaching to the converted, but what is perimenopause, menopause? And Imogen, would you like to answer that question and just give us a quick rundown?
Hello, can you hear me okay? Grand. Thank you for introducing me, Emma. So like I said, I'm a specialist in sexual and reproductive health, and as part of my NHS role, we deal with helping our primary care colleagues, our GP colleagues, in our menopause clinic with people who are having particularly tricky symptoms during the menopause. So it's a bit random how I've come to sauna bathing, just a quick introduction, but also as well as my NHS work, I do lots of outdoor education and outdoor work and strongly believe in the healing nature of the being outdoors. And strongly, I've been getting more involved in outdoor education and the intersection between health. And as part of this work, I've been doing lots of opportunities and lots of things in the Nordic countries where I was introduced to sauna bathing, and luckily in Scotland, saunas have really taken off, and we have this amazing opportunity for people to use saunas. So, what is menopause? Sorry if I am preaching to the converted. Everyone knows what it is, but the menopause is the permanent ending of menstrual cycles. So it's caused by the fall of eggs in the ovaries. So in normal healthy ovaries, roughly once a month, an egg is released, which is either then fertilized and going on to a pregnancy, or it's not. And the ovaries produce two really important hormones, estrogen and progesterone. And these hormones are basically trying to prepare the womb, so you're releasing an egg and preparing the womb for implantation of a fertilized egg. If that doesn't happen, then the womb lining is shed and the cycle starts again. Now, as we get older, the number and the qualities of our eggs reduce, which means we therefore produce less estrogen and progesterone. The womb lining stays thin and our periods stop, our bleeding stops. So the average age of the menopause in the UK is 51. Although about 1% of people under 40 will have what we call premature ovarian insufficiency. They'll have an early menopause. And also, interestingly, the age of menopause varies by ethnicity. So the perimenopause, or what we now more commonly call the menopause transition, is the lead up to the menopause, that last period. And the perimenopause is that period of time where our ovaries can sort of almost become a little bit wonky. So the amount of estrogen they produce fluctuates much more than our usual monthly cycle, and we can start to get symptoms of lack of estrogen deficiency. But the really, really interesting thing about perimenopause and menopause is everyone's journey is completely different. Everyone's symptoms are different. And those symptoms can vary not just by person to person, but even in a particular person day to day. So we know, although it is primarily due to the lack of estrogen, there's also lots of other interplaying factors which also influence people's symptoms. So traditionally, we thought estrogen, only had a role in reproduction, but now we have a much better understanding, and that almost all cells in the body have estrogen receptors, so they respond to estrogen in some way. So when we have a lack of estrogen, these estrogen receptors aren't activated, and we get lots and lots of different symptoms throughout all body systems. So 80% of women will have hot flushes and sweats. We call that vasomotor symptoms. But also we can have joint aches, mood change, anxiety, low mood, urinary symptoms, brain fog, headaches, palpitations. What we tend to say in menopause care is almost any symptom can be caused by the menopause. And these symptoms, these perimenopausal symptoms, last on average for around 7 years. But again, that's just an average. Some people will last much less, some people a lot longer. So that's a potted, quick perimenopause and menopause. An important thing quickly to say as well is diagnosis. So in someone who's over 45, we don't look for hormone levels. So we diagnose based on the history and symptoms alone. And yeah, very, very lastly, increasingly, we're doing more and more research into menopause because this has been really, really poorly researched, as has women's health in general. And hopefully the tide is turning, and we will talk about some of the interesting research that is going on shortly.
Brilliant. Thank you, Imogen. That is a brilliant, if what somewhat terrifying overview of the menopausal symptoms, which are, yes, well, anyone who's been in menopause knows they are many. And Kate, you are probably, in your experience at Saunapause, very well versed in hearing about people's symptoms and witnessing how women are using sauna to support themselves through the menopause. And what are they sort of telling you that it's helping them with?
I could first say a little bit about why I have this sauna business in the first place, and that is because of my own experience during my perimenopause. When I visited a wild sauna in Ireland, I was struggling with all sorts of different symptoms. Someone had finally mentioned the word perimenopause to try and work out what it was. So I was having these aching muscles and joints. I was a gardener, so I was really feeling my work at the end of a day. Insomnia and the fatigue that goes with it, brain fog. I'd had hot flushes, heart palpitations, and I was really concerned about my career and whether it's going to be sustainable or not. So I'd been a cold water swimmer for 10, 15 years, and I'd gone for a wild swim, and my friend invited me to the sauna that was on the beach, and came out, and something had changed. I didn't quite know what it was. I had this deep sense of relaxation and calm, but there was a funny kind of focus with it, which was unusual. I slept like I hadn't slept since I was a teenager, just long and deep, and just this general sense of well-being, alongside this really lovely feeling of being in the sauna with these different people and having really interesting conversations with people from actually all over the world on that particular day. So I went on this journey to find out more because I couldn't stop thinking about it. And I discovered something called Pertis, and Pertis was a doorway into learning about the ancient practices of sauna. And that was something that really ignited my curiosity. And I've been deep diving into it for 3 years. And having then set up my own sauna and visited other saunas and done training, I've witnessed women and just how it makes them feel and the things that they say. And ultimately, it just seems to make them feel really good. Women who come to my sauna, I've not got a huge sauna, but it's not anything like the London saunas that got huge capacity, but they come and they talk about, sometimes they're just curious because we don't have a sauna culture of any sort really in Derbyshire. There are gym saunas, but not really any wild saunas. And so they want to see what it's about, first of all. But they come and they say they feel relief from aches and pains. I had one woman who had to be helped into my garden by her friend. She couldn't get undressed. And she got into the sauna. She couldn't get into the cold plunge properly. She needed help with that. And after an hour session, I wouldn't say she was skipping and jumping, but she was moving with more fluidity. She was able to get herself dressed again. So it eased all those aches and pains. I have a lady who comes with frozen shoulder. She said it helps her with that, which is a menopausal symptom that is well known. Just physical tension, helping to relax, and just an opportunity to get away from everyday grind and stresses and family and work, and just have a little bit of time and space for yourself and a chance to meet other people and have a really lovely chat. Or sometimes just sit quietly, because we have some sessions where there's just this natural silence and it's really beautiful, and people come out and go, that was so lovely. Wasn't thinking I'd just sit quietly, but it just allows them to then sort of connect a little bit with their bodies and not just with each other. So yeah, so I think that sort of community that comes with it, because I have actually since then set up a specific session for women in menopause called Pause Sisters, and my mixed sessions have varying numbers, but in the 5 weeks since it started off with a little trickle, and last week it was completely full. And it just goes to show there is a definite demand or a need for that space to hold just for this group of people, this group of women, because there's a sort of shared understanding and the shared journey. And I think women really appreciate that.
Yes, I mean, we all hear lots of stories of all the health benefits among women in the menopause. I've certainly heard a few as well. And I think, Gid, you found sauna benefited you in some sort of unexpected ways that you didn't really think that was going to be the case. Do you want to sort of explain talk a bit about your experience?
Because obviously it's come from it's a very personal journey that I took to get into this to the sauna business, but I really believe that it's really important to understand how people come to sweat bathing. So I became extremely ill. I was working, I work as associate professor at UCL, and one day was struck with that half my world disappeared, my vision, and I was having a major stroke. And this led me to a number of weeks of being unable to see. I'm still partially blind, just somewhere over here, but I was blind on the left-hand side. It was right-hand side stroke in my cerebellum. And I wasn't able to walk, and my joints started to not work. And then, long story short, they found out I had something called systemic lupus, which caused me to have clots and lots of strokes over the years. Something like 34 minor strokes prior to this big one. And I really wasn't able to walk very well. I wasn't able to coordinate. And my Finnish relative was like, you need to get yourself in a sauna, love. So I started going regularly, ended up going pretty much every day. And day by day, I started to see some real physiological changes in my body. Was able to walk, the pain from my hands went where the lupus was attacking my joints, and I couldn't quite understand what was going on with myself. I mean, I was really happy that this was happening, and here I am today. It's not happened anymore. I don't think I'm going to share any further than that, but I mean, it was quite it was a momentous change. I've been going for years. I always loved that sweat bathing practice. Wasn't a fan of the cold, I'm Nigerian, Caribbean, but there's a little bit of Finnish blood in me, and but I do sort of avoid the cold. And my Finnish relative again said, no. He said, you come out of that sweat bathing, and then you take yourself to the cold, and you shift and shock your body, and that's what got me interested into what's this whole thing about heat shock. So I don't know if you want me to go on to talk about heat shock now. Should we?
We could, because we were talking about menopause, but actually we do need to go on to the science. And you obviously are a doctor, you know quite a lot about this topic and done lots of research into this. So please continue the science of what we know, and then what we think we know, and what we might be about to know.
Yeah, I think it's all learning. There's been a lot of focus on what the cold does for the body, and not so much of a focus on what the heat does for the body. And also, the focus is sort of, the lens hasn't really been on women that much. And then also, to add to that story, I was going through the menopause as well. So everything else started to come out and was worsened by menopause. So menopause, I didn't know for years that I had ADHD, or I was on the autism spectrum as well. And I was unable to concentrate. And when I went into that heat space, I was like, how am I sort of, afterwards, I was really focused. I had the post sauna sort of like high, or sauna brain as they call it. But for some reason, you know, the next few days, I could feel that I was able to concentrate for more. There's evidence around that now about the heat and how that impacts on ADHD. So there's lots of science starting to emerge about it. There have been a few studies. I've looked at something like 19,000 studies. From a personal point of view, that's not where my speciality lies in my work, and it's not what I do in my day-to-day. But as a researcher, I had to go into it, you know. I needed to understand. So one of the things that came up, which I kind of remembered from clinical sciences but hadn't really explored, was heat shock proteins. And so heat shock proteins are little gems running around the body. They're sort of like they're a molecular chaperone protein, and I'll explain it in layman's terms in a minute, but they're produced in the cells as a response to stress. So when we get into a stressful situation, elevated temperature, extreme cold, the body sort of triggers, and then the heat shock proteins start to kick in, and their primary function is to maintain sort of protein homeostasis, so maintain the levels and protect the cells. And they do that by assisting in the folding and refolding and stabilize transport or degradation of other proteins. So they sort of bind to all the sort of like the bits of the cells that are breaking down, and they sort of formulate, they activate and facilitate ATP within ATP is sort of like the protein which enables us to the cells to reproduce. So as we age, we lose the ability to do this well, right? So one of the, we're trying to find the sort of panacea. How do we stop aging? Well, we age every day, and there's that sort of way of looking at it, that if you take a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy, eventually it will disappear. And that's how people see the human body. When the cell reproduces, it's not quite as good as it was the next time, and the next and the next. But for some reason, when heat shock proteins come into the picture, they start to allow the cell to sort of like replicate itself that little bit better. So there's lots of different heat shock proteins, some more well researched than others. We've got heat shock protein 100, 90, 70, and I'm looking into all of these, and they all play a role to some extent in the menopause itself. So if we're putting our body into increased stress in that space, we're actually doing ourselves some good. So it might feel like the wrong thing to do when you suffer from sweats is to get into a hot space, like I'm sweating, but it's a different type of sweat. So the sweat that's happening for us in menopause is from thermoregulation in the brain and the hypothalamus, and it's working very, very differently. And I'm sure Imogen could probably go into the deep down science of that from a pragmatic point of view. But these heat shock proteins come in, and then they help us to, when they have a different sort of heat shock, start to repair our cells. So we're seeing some really interesting research. So, in summary, then it's a helper. It's a protective helper protein that turns on when your cells are under stress. So there's a very sciencey explanation I gave, and the easier one is it's a protein that switches on when your cells are under stress, and they go into stress when you go in extreme heat. So they repair, they protect, and they stabilize all the other proteins. Skin, one of the things that women with menopause are reporting back as well is their improved skin. And my daughter's always going, gosh, when you come out of the sauna, Mum, your skin looks great. And it's because it helps the protein that binds for collagen, for example. It helps us deal with fevers better and exercise better and oxidative stress better. So we're often hearing about, make sure we have flavonoids or eat your blackberries to reduce oxidative stress. Well, if you do that in conjunction with going into a sauna, you're helping with your oxidative stress. You're reducing inflammation. So what I was getting when I went into the sauna, stop me if I'm going on, I could talk for hours, but but when I went into this, when I came out of the sauna, what I couldn't understand is why I had this ability to move more fluidly. And this is because these heat shock proteins were kicking in in terms of reducing inflammation, helping my kidneys to excrete the toxins, getting more oxygen to my cells, but in a good way rather than sort of oxidative stress. It was good oxygen. And on top of that, obviously, it helps emotions and metabolic stress overall. But also, it's really good for the heart.
Good. Well, that's what I was going to ask, though. With, you know, men and women are different physiologically, well, in anatomically and hormonally, and in most ways, obviously. So the heat shock proteins and things like that. What are the differences how does the sauna affect them differently? Lisa, I don't know if you managed to get in. Is Lisa here? We were going to ask, Lisa was going to answer that one, but anybody else?
I am. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes. Is
Okay.
that Lisa?
It is, yes.
Oh,
I managed to
see you, but I can hear you. Fantastic.
Okay.
Oh, there you are.
I was listening to the heat shock proteins, and I'm not too sure about the differences in men and women in terms of heat shock proteins, but obviously there's going to be a difference in the way men and women handle the heat. So there'll probably be a response in terms of heat shock protein response as well. There's loads of differences between men and women. We all know that. And I think my day-to-day is an exercise scientist, so I'll kind of approach it from that exercise performance angle, but maybe translate obviously to the heat of the sauna as well. So I think the first thing we can think of is maybe body composition. So women tend to have more body fat than men in percentage wise, so maybe about 12% more body fat than men. And therefore we tend to have lower skeletal muscle mass as well. That's got big implications for exercise, but if we think about it in terms of heat and the capacity to handle heat, then we can think about heat exchange. So greater body fat, less skeletal muscle mass, that then affects our surface area to mass ratio. So women have a greater surface area to mass ratio, which means we can take in heat from the environment more, let's say, efficiently, whether we want it or not. So there's this heat exchange coming from, in the case of sauna, this external heat, and women tend to absorb that more effectively than men. But conversely, then, if we then think about cooling, because we don't want to get too hot and, you know, it's at stress, with that extra body fat, we then have maybe problems cooling ourselves more efficiently than men, because we've got that insulation layer. So, and Freya's here as well, who's more of an expert on heat than me, so she can maybe correct me if I'm going off on one. But women basically will get hotter than men in the same temperature, and have problems. I say problems, but it's good in a way, but problems cooling down effectively. Physiologically, so that's anatomically, if you think of differences. Physiologically, women sweat less, so men sweat more per gland than women. So again, we've got now more inefficiencies with cooling down once we're in that heat environment. So women tend to rely more on what's called cutaneous vasodilation. So we're pushing blood out from the core to the skin surface and trying to cool the body through that transfer from the skin back into the environment. So again, the key difference with men and women: men sweat more to cool down in that hot environment. Women use cutaneous vasodilation, shunting blood to the skin surface to try to effectively cool down as well. And I'm going to touch on one more thing, which again is very much implicated with exercise performance, but it's the anatomical differences in that cardiovascular system. So heart size, for example, men have bigger hearts, women smaller hearts. And if we think about the left ventricle, so a smaller left ventricle in women means that we can't pump out as much blood per heartbeat as men do. So to compensate, we then have to increase the heart rate to distribute blood around the body effectively. So again, if we bring that back to being in a hot environment, trying to cool ourselves down because we don't want to have core temperature raised, to dangerous levels, we now have a greater cardiovascular, which is where I think a lot of the research on cardiovascular health with sauna use is pinned upon, is this stress that women, well, everybody goes through, but if we're talking about women, we've got a greater cardiovascular stress when we're in the same temperature as men. So potentially, looking at the health benefits, then maybe women get more from sauna in terms of that cardiovascular stress, and then hopefully a knock-on effect in terms of improvement within the system itself.
Oh, that's really interesting. And so that is, yes, cardiovascular health is something that has been studied with the Jari Laukkanen study into men mainly. And I think I heard there were some women in that study, but do any of you know about cardiovascular, well, beyond what you've said, or as well as what you've said, Lisa, have any studies been done into that specific area, women's cardiovascular health in the heat?
We'll ask Freya in a second. I think the only thing I can think of was not necessarily directly with cardiovascular health, but more looking at menopause with hot flashes. So looking at the body's ability, the vascular system's ability to control the hot flash through vasodilation and vasoconstriction. So I think there was a study, maybe, I think it's Bailey 10 years ago, that looked specifically at heating women up and seeing their thermo response to the heat, and found that with sauna use and with exercise training as well, there was some positive effects on the hot flash intensity. But that's as much as I know in terms of research so far.
And the other thing you talked about was the cold, women finding it more difficult to cool ourselves down. So the role of the cold in all of this. I don't know if Freya, maybe you want to answer this one. What is the role of cold in this process?
If it's all right, I might start with just adding on to the heat first before I go to the cold.
Yeah, of course.
And I might add a bit to Julian's and Lisa's answers here, but I also come from a sport background, and I lecture in psychology and physiology, so I'm a bit of a mixture of disciplines, and you'll probably see that in the way that I answer things, because I think they are related to each other. We can't just view them as one thing. But when we actually go into a sauna, several physiological systems respond at the same time. And importantly, it's not these are the same systems that menopause tends to make more sensitive or less effective. And that's why sauna bathing can feel particularly beneficial during this life stage. And it's not just the heat or the sweating responses that Lisa was talking about, it's the combined response across temperature regulation, the cardiovascular system, hormones, stress pathways, and musculoskeletal health. So I'm just going to go into those in a little bit of detail. So I think one of the main risks during menopause and after menopause is related to the cardiovascular system. And I really wanted to start with that. So when we are exposed to heat, there is an increase in core body temperature, which makes blood vessels widen, increase in heart rate, and produce similar effects to light intensity of exercise. And during menopause, the fall in estrogen reduces the vascular elasticity and slightly increases that cardiovascular risk. So regular repeated exposure via saunas gives that circulatory system a safe training stimulus. So over time, it helps counteract some of the vascular stiffness and reactivity that can emerge post-menopause. And I think that's one thing that we really need to focus more on in research. Then when it comes to the sweating and temperature regulation, Julian mentioned earlier the hypothalamus. This is our central region in our brain that controls our temperature. And the menopause actually narrows this. So it means that small temperature shifts can trigger these hot flushes. And in the sauna, sweating and cooling can happen in a controlled, predictable way. So repeated heat exposure can widen this comfortable temperature zone, helping us more easily handle shifts in temperature so that we're not suffering from those hot flushes as regularly. And then we also have a calming of the nervous system. So we know that during the menopause, there's a heightened stress sensitivity, partly due to changes in cortisol regulation and poor sleep quality. But we also know that passive heat exposure shifts the body towards a parasympathetic dominant. So that's that slower breathing, lower stress hormones, and more endorphins. So that's why many women describe coming out of a sauna of feeling leveled out, because it quietens those systems that amplify things like anxiety, irritability, and mood swings. And also, in terms of the sleep, that window of time of coming out of a sauna and cooling down, that almost mimics that temperature response just before you go to sleep. So if you're getting exposed to that in a more regular time, that also helps your body fall into that pattern and helps with improving sleep quality in the menopause. And then the last thing I wanted to add on to this is more like the muscle, joints, and connective tissue. So we talked a little bit about collagen and joint stiffness. We know that because of the decline in estrogen, this causes a decrease in our collagen, joint lubrication, and inflammation. And that's why it causes joint stiffness. And sauna bathing, specifically that heat exposure part, increases blood circulation to the muscles and connective tissues, and that helps with relaxation and reducing that stiffness. So it makes movement more comfortable, supporting recovery from both exercise and daily physical stress. So I think sauna bathing, it doesn't fix the menopause per se, but it gives the very systems that struggle during menopause a healthier, more predictable environment to work in. And that's why so many women feel calmer, sleep better, and feel more control in their bodies.
Fascinating. Are any of these things? Well, I don't know who or wants to talk about the role of the cold, if there is a role of the cold, because the heat's doing all these things. So is the cold complementary to what's going on in our menopausal bodies when we take the heat, do you think, Freya or Lisa or whoever would like to answer that question? Because they do seem to go together in a very unscientific way, just as a feeling they go together. But it would be nice to hear what is actually kind of happening there.
Yeah. Well, cold exposure is very similar to heat in a way. It provides a physiological stimulus and it has similar pathways, but it, instead of dilating, it constricts the blood vessels. So that almost stabilizes a vasodilation constriction. And it's that actual part of the vascular system that drives the hot flushes. And that's what we're finding in the research now. We know where it's coming from. So by using hot and cold exposure, we can almost manipulate this pathway and see what's actually happening. Cold also causes a rapid release of adrenaline, noradrenaline, and endorphins, and it's that combination that causes that mood lift. I think a lot of people who have done cold immersion normally associate it with that extreme mood boost straight afterwards. And similar to heat, cold is shown to reduce inflammation signaling and also joint discomfort. I think a lot of us always think of cold to be one of the first things that you do after injury or for recovery. But like heat, cold also controls the nervous system, and being exposed to these extreme temperatures helps handle stress more efficiently. And it's also that stress trigger that causes hot flushes as well. That's one of the main triggers of that. But we're seeing more and more research now about contrast therapy. And I think a lot of people have tried contrast therapy now, which involves moving between heat, so it could be sauna bathing, or cold, which might be cold water immersion via swimming in the sea or cold plunges. And the most important thing I want to highlight about this is that this creates a really powerful vascular workout. So that difference from blood vessels constricting and dilating and repeating that process. And this really improves that circulation and vascular responsivity, which is something that really matters because, like we've said before, the cardiovascular risk is really prominent during and post menopause. Lisa, is there anything you want to add on that?
Lisa?
I think you covered it all there, but I think just thinking about the sauna, when you're in that hot environment for a period of time, we often think about the cold plunging, cold water therapy as well, but maybe just coming out of that hot environment is also a stimulus. So going from hot to cold, and as you say, it is that workout from that dilation effect, that cutaneous dilation within the skin, to suddenly being in a cooler environment where we can then constrict the blood vessels again to retain some of that heat as well. And I think it is that, just that it is a contrast. It's the stress of dilation, constriction, which, just like exercise, has this training effect on the cardiovascular system and basically just helps us in our normal daily lives, whether it's stress or just living, to control that autonomic nervous system, to control the vascular tone, and therefore sort of things like blood pressure and resting heart rate.
Yeah, and that quite links to kind of like people doing it in practice. I think one thing that me and Lisa see a lot in our work is a lot of people wanting to go and try contrast therapy for recovery from exercise. And I think one thing that's not clear at the moment is kind of that dose response relationship of how long you should be going in each one, how many times, how regularly, that kind of thing. And if anybody is interested in doing it, I think the kind of general suggestion at the moment is that it should be short, cold exposures, even 10 to 20 seconds, and build it gradually. And it doesn't need to be extreme temperatures either, even just like a cold shower or a brief dip in the water afterwards, or even just standing outside post sauna can still have effective benefits. It doesn't need to be an ice plunge per se. But one thing that we do know, timing wise, for menopause is that it should be based on your symptoms. So if your main symptoms are related to sleep problems, night sweats, or evening irritability, then you should be doing evening contrast therapy because that's more likely to be helpful. But if your symptoms are more related to brain fog, low morning energy, or stress reactivity during the day, then morning contrast therapy might be more beneficial for you. Or if it's just hot flushes that your main issue, then either timing would work because both have shown that regular cold and heat exposure reduces the flush intensity. But evenings might be extra beneficial if the flushes are disrupting your sleep.
So interesting. So there's so many advantages, but there are so many obstacles for so many women. And I think, well, Kate and Gid, you're both Kate. Maybe Gid. What do you think are the perceived barriers you've seen throughout your very long sauna bathing history? Especially for menopausal women, middle-aged women. What are the hurdles that we have to try and, break down a bit to encourage people to come to
I think there's the psychological myth that, I'm menopausal, why on earth would I go into a hot space is the first thing, really. And it's like trying to debunk that, that a hot flush is the same as an induced intentional sweat practice. I think they're very, very different. I think also, confidence, self-confidence. I think Kate can speak to that as well. I'll like to hand over to Kate on that after, maybe, to talk about how people's just self-worth and, people don't want to show their bodies off. So there's body consciousness. I feel as an ordinary woman, I find it quite disconcerting that a lot of the ads we see in saunas is extremely sort of like slender, muscular, lithe people going into saunas looking like supermodels. And the reality is this is an ancient practice that has been used for 40,000 years globally without any scientific evidence behind it. We now understand the science behind it because we've had this development in technology, the ability to even see what's going on in a cell and what the mitochondria are doing, actually isolating these teeny tiny proteins that are regulating how the cells are healing themselves. But sauna spaces are really important for women to either have a sense of self, to have a little bit of, a lot of the time when I've been in those spaces, women come out feeling really invigorated. Sleep regulation absolutely is a big thing. Vasomotor sort of symptoms, sort of beyond heat shock proteins, obviously hypothalamic regulatory thermoregulation, as Freya was talking about earlier, and Lisa, it's this widening of our tolerance of heat is absolutely crucial for women of a certain age. I think it's really interesting what you said about the timings of sauna. I find if I get it wrong for my symptoms, if other women get it wrong, I can't sleep. So if I get the timing of the heat to the cold, if I have too much cold exposure, I have a tendency to struggle to get to sleep. But if I just have a slightly longer sauna session in the evening, tiny bit of cold exposure, I can't always cope with a cold plunge. And a lot of women can't do that. Also, we're very different culturally. So when most people think of sauna, and they think of Finnish sauna or banya in the global north, but sort of like for the majority world, men and women are kept very separate. I think even in Finnish saunas, a lot of the time there are men's sessions and women's sessions, and there's really good evidence or anecdotal evidence behind that in terms of, obviously women not exposing their bodies to men, not feeling very comfortable exposing their bodies at all in front of anybody. That's the thing. Just religious beliefs, stopping people from being in the same spaces. But then, there is historical evidence that points to the fact that births took place in sweat rooms. So Temescal in Mexico, for example, women would go there in a specially built one to give birth. Same thing happened in Ethiopia, in Africa. Women would go in a really hot space to facilitate the birthing process. It seems, we're told to avoid it in the global north. So it's the same Jimjilbang in Korea. Women are encouraged to use these spaces and feel normal. So you get, your autonomic nervous system is regulated when you get into that space, has been hit on before, parasympathetic nervous system. And the tone post-session means that you get this improved autonomic balance. And that has a really big impact on cardiovascular function, levels of stress, being able to cope. And sleep improvement is just the icing on the cake. But you do have to get it right. And I think there can be all the science in the world, and we need to understand it more. I don't think there's enough science personally at the moment. I think it's just really getting going. I think we've got to get it out of our heads that this thing is new. This is a rebirth for us in the global north in terms of saunas. I mean, people are suddenly waking up to the fact they have to listen to their bodies a little bit more. And there was a wonderful post recently that I read, and I said, how lovely that somebody's not putting a timer in a sauna for the reason to stop this whole idea of I have to stay in for this amount of time, and then people feel like failures when they're in there. What we find is when women talk in that space, they have a tendency to be able to stay in the sauna for longer.
Do you find this, Kate? Sorry, Kate.
Yeah, I want to hold a hand to Kate.
No. You've covered loads there.
Yes.
Definitely. And yeah, it's interesting that women who sort of sometimes go in thinking they're not going to manage the heat, you'll sort of go at 15 minutes and they're so in the flow of conversation, they can stay in another 10 minutes and be in danger of maybe overcooking. So, but yeah, you were talking about the barriers though, Emma, and this preconceived ideas of what sauna is and what contrast therapy is has got a lot to do with it. And that's maybe about how we message that through our marketing as sauna owners or operators to make women feel like maybe they could belong in that space, to make them feel like they feel safe in that space and they can feel safe in that space. That's sort of physically, emotionally, socially. and that it's relatively easy. And there's some real sort of practicalities around that, just as to the time of day when sessions are on, whether it's an all-female session. I mean, my own personal experience, I did my training in mixed groups, and then I had one opportunity, or two actually, opportunities to have all female training just by coincidence, and I couldn't believe the difference in the experience of just being all women. I didn't think I had any hang-ups around men whatsoever, but the ease that came of just being in female company, it was phenomenal, the difference. And so, and I think that it's sort of, that fact is become apparent through the sessions that I've started putting on just for women. They're coming, and they're coming in number, and they're telling their friends, because there's maybe an inhibition that has been removed, an unspoken inhibition that's been removed. But yeah, I think the messaging, how we talk about sauna, how women, you've already said it, Gid, that it's not about the temperature, it's about how your body feels. And if they realize that's what it's about, and this message about listening to your body, so then you've got the choice and you have the control to leave when you feel like your body needs to leave. I mean, we are in a bit of a comfort crisis, and we've talked about this stresses and that as a beneficial stress. So there's a sort of a fine balance between being a bit too comfortable and just finding that edge of where it's going to be beneficial to just go maybe that tiny little bit out of your comfort zone, sort of building resilience and stimulating these physiological responses. What else was I going to say about how to make it maybe more inviting? But maybe having temperature differences, actually, making the temperature of the sauna a little bit cooler, because there are definite benefits for that. You don't have to be sweating profusely, or sort of raging heat to get the benefits. Having different heights in the sauna, so you can choose again where you'd like to sit and which form of heat you'd like to take. What else? Yeah, I think just general education about what the sauna space can be for you, I think would really help.
Yes, I mean, it feels like we've all, there's so much, isn't there, that we need to learn still, because we're new to it all in this country. And I mean, one of the next part of this talk, just for the last 10 minutes before we go to the Q&A, was sort of like, I feel like we've tried to cover where we're at a bit in terms of the science and everything, but the future now, this is a really big topic. And what, there are lots of unanswered questions, but Freya, I think maybe you wanted to say, you've probably all got something to say about what are the biggest gaps in understanding, but do you want to say something first, Freya, about that?
Yeah, I think one of the current own questions is why menopausal women are more sensitive to heat and cold. I feel like we're kind of just scratching the surface in terms of research. Our group at LSBU, we already study how humans adapt to repeated heat exposure. We spend a lot of our time preparing athletes for competitions that are in hot environments. So we have a good understanding of how long it might take women versus males to adapt to these conditions. We know that it takes women longer to adapt due to hormonal and temperature fluctuations from menstrual cycle phase. However, we don't know if this is the same or longer for menopausal women. So that's one area we really want to look into more. And just from an exercise point of view, we know that menopausal symptoms are strongly shaped by stress, sleep, and autonomic balance. And I think we have a good understanding of how heat and cold influence those symptoms and also energy systems, but not how thermal therapies such as cold baths, hot baths, and saunas influence inflammation in menopausal women. And that's one thing we've also been working on. We've tried to compare these for post-exercise recovery. And we want to see whether the mechanisms that can help athletes recover can be transferred to menopausal women, because it's not just about tolerance per se. We want to help women feel better experience fewer symptoms, and also crucially still participate in exercise because we want to support women to move through the menopause as well.
And Lisa, did you want to say it? I know Imogen is Imogen, I can't see you. It's so weird talking into the abyss. Oh, you're back. You wanted to say something about where do we start? When we talked about this earlier, you had some good thoughts on this.
Yes, so I guess I'm not coming from the physiology perspective, but as a practicing doctor, really, really interested in how menopause helps symptoms. And it's something we're really, really lacking in research. Lots of menopause research focuses on hormone replacement therapy. And like I was saying earlier, we know a lot of these symptoms are due to estrogen deficiency, but also there's way more to play than just estrogen deficiency. And for some people, HRT is contraindicated because they can't have HRT for a number of reasons. And we're really lacking options to help them with their menopause symptoms. And I feel like perhaps sauna is a potential avenue for those people who can't have HRT. So certainly what we're starting to look at some of our very early stages of research is looking at sauna use and whether it is helping a number of menopause symptoms. And particularly, we're sort of looking to the cold water swimming world. There was a really nice observational study done with 1,000 cold water swimmers, asking them, it's questionnaire based, but asking them if they were helping using the cold water for their menopause or menstrual symptoms. And unsurprisingly, lots of them are. And lots of us who have been going to saunas, sauna operators are reporting there are lots of women using sauna for menopausal symptoms, but we just don't have that collection of data, or we don't really even have many stories from women. So we're at this initial scoping stage where I think we're starting to get some qualitative data before we can really start looking at some of the more quantitative stuff and really start some larger scale studies. And I think we're at a bit of a turning point where women's health is finally getting the recognition, or more of the recognition and more of the funding it deserves. So, I think we're at a real turning point where we can start to do some really, really good research into women's health, and sauna and menopause, I think, is really exciting.
And do you think that where is the UK in relation to other countries? I don't know who wants to answer this question. Is this kind of conversation not really happening in other sauna bathing nations, or are they quite far ahead of us? Does anyone know?
In terms of research or just in terms of practice?
In terms of research.
I can come in there a little bit, just having a look at the sort of the studies that I've been looking at. I mean, most of the studies are very focused around the Nordic countries that I've looked at. I was trying to get, and they're very white as well. So we're not looking at women from different cultures and different backgrounds. So I think there's a massive, massive need whenever we do any of this research. I look at inclusive research, and for it to be inclusive, not only do we need women's voices and focus, as Imogen quite clearly said, and it's absolutely so important, Imogen, that women's health has not been given the funding that it deserves. But when I've looked at these studies, there's very little. When I was trying to look around African women and what they were doing, it's all anecdotal. There's no sort of like, there are definitely no RCTs. Apart from the Laukkanen study, that massive study, we're very devoid of evidence, really. And it's sort of small sort of pockets of evidence that we're getting out of there. America is normally way ahead on these things, but I really don't think they are with this. Australia, I would say, there's some good research coming out from Australia. They've got quite a hefty bather culture out there. They've got their own bathing practice. The UK is, I think we're at the precipice of doing something great, but definitely so much more work. I hope one day to see it prescribed for women to be prescribed to go to the sauna.
There's the Korean study that's come out from last year, which was looking at women, but it was more from a sort of social perspective, and how sauna in women of menopausal age. I think it was from a sort of like early 40s to maybe early 60s, 40 to 60, saying how they found an increased sense of community, and at that age of life where maybe they were empty nesters, their children have started to become more independent, and they had a little bit more free time. And in Korea, sauna is much more affordable. And when you go to sauna, it's not just sauna, there's gyms, there's restaurants, cafes. It's a real opportunity to expand their sort of relationships and their social interaction and build this sort of sense of belonging. And I think the report was actually called Sauna as My Nest, because it's just this really sort of nurturing practice and space to go to where you can meet with other women and really feel like you belong. It fosters this beautiful sense of connection.
Yes, well, I think we all agree, widely, we all agree, don't we? Need more research, we need more women to tell their stories and go to the sauna and generally get the word out there a bit more. But I thank you, everybody, because we could talk for ages because you're all so super knowledgeable and it's really interesting.